You know, we all love a good hero story, right? But what if the way we tell those stories is actually holding us back? What if they're limiting how we think about solving some of our biggest problems? Well, today, we're going to dig into the incredible story of one American hero to uncover this hidden pattern in our history, an asymmetry, if you will, that really does shape the world we live in. Okay, picture this. It is 1887. You've got this young woman standing in front of a judge. Her hands are shaking, her voice is trembling, and she's doing it all on purpose. She's trying with everything she's got to convince everyone that she's completely insane. Now, why on earth would she do that? Because the only way to get a look inside the women's lunatic asylum was to get herself committed. So, that woman? Her real name was Elizabeth Cochran, but the world came to know her as Nellie Bly. And her story? Well, it's the key that unlocks everything we're going to talk about today.
And believe me, this whole thing moved at lightning speed. So in October of 1887, Bly gets herself in. For just 10 days, that's it, 10 days, she lived and documented this absolutely brutal reality: the neglect, the awful food, the abuse. As soon as her newspaper pulled her out, her report called 10 Days in a Madhouse, it just exploded. The public was outraged, an investigation was launched, and boom, a massive funding increase to fix the whole asylum system. I mean, it was a total clear-cut victory.
And just like that, Nellie Bly became the model, the blueprint for a very specific kind of American hero, the reformer. She's that fearless person who dives into a broken public system, exposes all its flaws, so that we can build a better, stronger version in its place. It's a really powerful story, and yeah, it's super inspiring.
But what's interesting is her story also helped cement this pattern, right? A kind of logic for how we do reform that we still pretty much follow today. So let's actually break down the core idea that this kind of story reinforces.
Okay, so here's the crucial part. The big takeaway from Nellie Bly's heroism wasn't that state-run asylums were a bad idea. No, the takeaway was that the idea was good. It was just being done badly. So the solution? It wasn't to question the whole concept of the asylum. It was to give it more money, more oversight, more power. It boils down to this: when government fails, our default answer is just better government.
But, and this is where things get really interesting, what if that's only half the story? What if that incredible, heroic narrative, as important as it is missing a huge piece of the puzzle? What if there's another story here, one that's been almost completely forgotten?
And that brings us right to the main idea for today. It's this concept called the asymmetry. And really, it's just an imbalance in the stories we tell ourselves, the ones we remember, and maybe more importantly, the ones we just let fade away.
So what exactly is this asymmetry? Well, think of it like this. We build monuments, right? Both literal statues and just, cultural monuments to the Nellie Blys of the world. Those heroes who demand a better government. But at the same time, we have basically zero memory of the skeptics, the people who are asking a much more fundamental question, which was, hey, should the government even be in this business in the first place?
And that contrast really lays out the two different ways of thinking. You've got the reformer, who sees a broken system and says, okay, let's fix this thing, which means asking for better government. And then you have the skeptic, who looks at that exact same broken system and asks, wait a minute, why does this even exist? And starts looking for totally different alternatives, which usually means asking for smaller government. See the difference? One of these stories gets told over and over. The other one? Pretty much ignored.
So who were these forgotten skeptics? Well, they were around at the time. These weren't voices from the future, they were there. But they were almost completely shut out of the big public conversation. And their perspective? Well, it paints a completely different picture.
Okay, a really key idea here comes from this French economist, Frédéric Bastiat. He had this concept called the seen versus the unseen. And it sounds complicated, but it's actually a really simple, powerful idea. The seen is the obvious stuff, right? The direct result of some action. So the government builds a big asylum. We can see the building, we can see the jobs it creates. But the unseen, that's all the stuff that didn't happen because the government did that one thing.
So let's apply this right to the asylum debate. What was seen? Well, the big, imposing asylum building, the government jobs for the staff. You get this tangible feeling of progress, right? But what was unseen? All the other possibilities that got pushed aside, the ones that never even got a chance to grow.
Things like community groups, care-based within families, private charities, mutual aid societies. I mean, you could have had a whole ecosystem of smaller, voluntary solutions that might have popped up instead.
And look, it wasn't just Bastiat. You had other thinkers like Karl Menger, who was arguing that a central authority could never have enough information to manage something as complex as human needs from the top down. You had American economists like Frank Fetter, who warned that if you create a public monopoly with no competition, it's eventually going to lose all accountability. And then way later, you have someone like Thomas Szasz arguing that the whole idea of involuntary commitment is basically a form of state coercion.
But here is the absolute kicker. This entire logical counterargument, it never broke through. It never made it into the mainstream conversation. So while Nellie Bly was becoming a household name, all these other ideas were just stuck in academic journals and college classrooms. They were basically ghosts in the debate.
So, what's the big takeaway here? Well, once you recognize this asymmetry, it gives you a totally new way of looking at our history and, frankly, at the world around us today. It's kind of like stepping out of a cave for the first time.
You know, you could almost say our whole understanding of reform is a lot like Plato's famous allegory of the cave. We've been sitting inside, for generations, just watching these shadows flicker on the wall, and we've come to believe that the shadows are reality.
And what are those shadows? Well, it's that cycle we keep seeing. A hero like Nellie Bly exposes a problem. The public gets angry and demands action. The institution gets a bigger budget, more rules. And then, what happens a few decades later? The whole cycle just repeats itself. We keep trying to fix the shadows on the wall, but we never turn around to question the thing that's casting them in the first place.
Now, I want to be really clear here. This is not some argument for one political side over the other. The point is not government bad, markets good. Not at all. It's just a recognition that for a long, long time, we've only been listening to one side of the debate. And the stories we choose to remember, well, they end up defining what we believe is even possible.
And because of this historical asymmetry, we never really gave the unseen a fair shot. We never seriously asked the question, what would a world with competitive charities and community homes and mutual aid societies, what would that actually look like? We have no idea if it would have been better or worse, but the important thing is, that question was never even on the table to begin with.
And that leaves us with a pretty big question to chew on. If our view of history has been this lopsided in this one area, where else are we missing half the story? Because once you start looking for this pattern, you kind of start to see it everywhere. So the question is, what other unseen possibilities, what other solutions are just waiting for us right outside the cave?